President of the Northam and Districts Historical Society, Jeffrey Pollard, will take the podium now, and please give him a warm welcome. Jeffrey will be talking to Northam, first settlement to railway boom.
I'm old school, so I use paper. Not actually born in Northam. I was born in Queensland. There's only two types of people in this world, those that were born in Queensland and those that wish they were. But I have been extensively bred in Northam. So my speech, I might have to get you the page turn maybe.
Yep. Okay.
Whoops. Yep. Okay. So my speech is on John Morrell, who was the first settler of Northam that arrived here. And the later part of the speech is the railway, the boom that led up to the railway boom of the late 1890s, of which Northam now owes, probably unknown to Northam, quite a bit in terms of where it is today. So the original area around Northam was first explored in 1830 by a party of colonists led by the famous ensign Robert Dale, and was subsequently founded, quote unquote, in 1833. It was named by Governor of Stirling, probably after the village of the same name in Devon, England, though there is some debate about that. So although the story of John Morrell is typical of all the pioneers of the Northern District, it has one point of difference. He was the first. Morrell took up the first land, built the first farmhouse, turned the first sod, imported the first livestock to the district, and sent the first farm produce to Perth. So John Morrell was born in Bloomsbury in the city of Westminster in Greater London about 1785. He married Mary Ann, known as Anne, née Thorpe, in 1808, and they had 4 surviving children, John, Richard, Frederick and Anne, and he carried on a career as a carpenter and builder. But in 1830, at the age of 45, not long after the Swan River colony had been founded, he decided to leave England with his family and take up farming in the fledgling colony on the Swan River. They left London on the first day of September 1830 and ran in almost immediately into trouble in a storm in the English Channel, and they spent 10 hours on the pumps, keeping the boat afloat. So they had to go back again, but in the diary of his voyage to the Swan River colony, it opened by Morrell in simple and direct language. 1st of September 1830, at 8 o'clock in the morning, we hired a hackney coach which took us and our luggage to Steam Packet Wharf, London Bridge. And that was it. John and Mary and 2 of their children, Frederick and Anne, boarded the sailing ship Rambler. On the following day, they set on their first trip to the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa. Their voyage was delayed by storms for over 3 weeks, and the Rambler didn't head out into the open sea again until October of 1830. So at Table Mountain at Cape Town, they arrived there on Christmas Day 1830, and they stopped off to gather some supplies, some vines, trees for an orchard, potatoes and things like that, and also met up with Richard, who had sailed ahead of them. So arrangements were made with Captain Waddell of the Eliza, a small sailing ship of 390 tonnes, to take them to the Swan River settlement. So the second part of the voyage ended in February 1831 when the Eliza founded a sandbank in Coburn Sound near Clarence in the vicinity of Woodham Point, about 13 miles south of Fremantle. The landing was made in small boats, which were brought out as close as possible to the shore, and then the women and children were carried to the beach, while the men and boys waded ashore. At the spot where they landed was a small well, and nearby they erected a shack, which they lived in for about 4 months. Then they shifted to Fremantle, where they were joined by the other son, John, who had come via Tasmania, out from England. In a letter written shortly after his arrival, Richard, who was then a young man of 23, admits that the Morrells had not done much in the way of cultivation, but had attended mostly to building. Richard, like his father, was also a carpenter, so their services were in great demand in the infant colony. Richard mentions, however, that they did have a small spot of ground that they cleared, about 3 acres, cultivated and fenced within a half a mile of Fremantle, which appears to have been on or near the site of the Fremantle Town Hall. The plot was sown in wheat and barley, but didn't turn out as well as expected. And later on, they had another larger area of 10 acres at Karrakatta in the vicinity of the cemetery, where they planted another 10 acres of crop, which also didn't do very well. But by then they'd heard the exploration of Dale, and he indicated that it was good farming land of heavy loam in the vicinity of the junction of two rivers, the Avon River and what was then known as the Salt River, but is now known as the Mortlock. So Richard wrote in 1832 that I think we shall begin to cultivate some land when ours is measured out. Having decided on Northam, so after Morell's goods and chattels were assessed and assayed, he was directed to take up an area of 4,500 acres at a distance of about 23 miles down the Avon River from Mount Bakewell. At the time, Mount Bakewell was the main survey point of what was then known as the Eastern Districts. The land was named Morby Farm and the adjoining Island Farm, where the Northam Gun Club is now. In July of 1832, John and Richard set out from Fremantle with a bullock dray and after leaving Guildford, followed the cart track to York. After this, Morell would be forced to cut his own track along the Avon River, which he reached on July 11, 1832. It was firmly in the minds of his descendants that Morell used to say he made the first cart track to Northam. Mary Ann Morell, John's wife, unfortunately passed away at the age of 43 in Fremantle on the 8th of October 1832 and was buried in the old Elmer Street Cemetery, which is now part of Fremantle Primary School. Her grave is one of the oldest in Fremantle and she's believed to be the first European woman to have been buried there. Her grave was removed at the family's request in October 1915 and she was reinterred at Fremantle Cemetery. On the 22nd of February, however, John remarried to Eleanor Green, who was born in 1809 at the Bush Inn between Fremantle and Perth, somewhere in the vicinity of Mahogany Creek. So as far as is known, Morell brought no livestock to the colony, but while he was still in England, he arranged a partnership with Peter Chidlow and his brother William, who were agriculturalists of some experience, to buy livestock, mainly sheep, and to bring them out to the colony. Prior to his death, John Morell granted 1,460 acres of Morby Farm to Peter Chidlow, which was purchased by his brother William Chidlow on Peter's death. So this area became Springfield Farm, adjacent to Morby Farm, and is centred on where the Northam Country Club and the golf course is today. So before Morell's arrival in the colony, before the Chidlow's arrival in the colony, which is in about 1834, Morell had erected fences necessary for folds for the overnight penning of sheep on his property, his potential property in Northam. Morell then left Northam and went to Perth with Richard, and they assisted in the erection of some of the earliest buildings in the colony. It appears that the Chidlow brothers may have worked Morby Farm while John was waiting for his land grant to be approved. So the family history records that John and Richard had cleared, ploughed and seeded a small paddock by seeding time of 1833, and by 1835 the Morells were processing butter and cheese and selling it in Perth. It was then that the Chidlows were working the farm while the Morells were engaged probably in the building projects in Perth. So exactly when the Morells settled in Morby Farm is the subject of some speculation. It's likely that John made trips to the land he had selected from 1832 onwards, but it is generally accepted view now that the family did not take up permanent residence until 1836, after the land had been finally permanently granted to him in 23rd of January 1836. This has caused some confusion in the celebration of Northam's centenary and Sisquey centenary. The town fathers in 1933 decided that 1833 was a good starting point, so that's when they held Northam's centenary. But 50 years later, the combined then town and the then Shire of Northam decided that no, that was wrong. They needed to celebrate it from 1836. So we had the Sisquey centenary 53 years after the centenary in 1986. The bicentenary is coming up now, so the Shire has just been asking me what date they think we should settle on. Unfortunately, I wasn't around, but frankly, I would trust the people that were here in 1933 that probably had a living connection with the early settlers to say 1833 was probably the date. Anyway, it goes on. So John was assigned land grant P1 of 4,000 acres, which extended south of Morby Cottage to roughly where the Northam Racecourse is today out towards the Great Eastern Highway, and land grant P2 of 500 acres, which extends north to roughly where the Northam Airport is today. So John and Richard began clearing the land and cultivating corn, but the first 3 seasons were very dry and the river didn't run. Despite this slow start, eventually the seasons turned around and the Morells began cultivating wheat and his flock of sheep continued to grow. Morell built the farmhouse on Morby Farm using locally sourced materials, but the doors and window frames and glass panes had travelled with him on the ship on the long and arduous journey from England. The doors and windows and a very few of the original glass panes still survive today at Morby Cottage. And some of you, I believe, are going on bus trips out to Morby this afternoon. So you'll see where the original windows and doors are. And if you're lucky, you might find the 3 panes. There's a trick to finding them. But anyway, Morby's farm, Morell's farm, has a great acclaim and importance just in being the pioneer farm of the district. Cottage was crucial to the early colonial life in Northam, serving as the town's first church, school, courthouse and retail and postal outlet. It was the centre from which Old Northam developed. It was Northam's first school and the first church, and maybe the first flour was ground there and the first butter and cheese was prepared. The school at Morby Farm was a private one and the first teacher was a James Knight. The first church services were conducted there by Reverend Harper of Toodyay, then known as Newcastle, who used to pay periodical visits. Flour was ground in a mill erected on the farm by Frederick Morell. A cheese press was amongst the goods brought out from England with the Morells, and good quality cheese was made with it. Morby Cottage also served as temporary accommodation for the visiting police constable from Toodyay and was used as a temporary courthouse. In October of 1843, however, John Morell passed away, possibly the victim of a practical joke. In those days, a higher price was paid for sheep after the wool had been cleaned, and it was the practice of farmers to wash their sheep in a river. So races were built alongside the Avon, where the current was strong. So the men from Morby Farm were engaged in the task of washing sheep when a burst of laughter announced that a man named Scott had been pushed into the river. The laughter died away when it was seen that he did not rise to the surface. So John Morell plunged into the icy cold water and was successful in locating the man and bringing him out. Unfortunately, the rescued man contracted pneumonia and died a few days after. It was at his funeral that Morell indicated the place where he would like to be buried. On the spot on the top of a hill, windswept hill now known as Doctor's Hill, near the intersection of the present Gillett Road and Gamelling Road, where a wattle tree grew with branches that swept the ground. The chill that Morell received from his plunge in the river also led to pneumonia, and he died a fortnight later on the 18th of October 1843. He was buried at the spot where he had chosen, and his 4 children were at the graveside. Shortly after that, however, John Morell, the son, announced that he was leaving the colony. In those days, you had to give 7 days' notice that you were leaving the colony so people could serve their debts on you. And he went to sea and was never heard of by the family ever again. They don't know whether he ended up in the eastern states. There was a John Morell that died there in 1892, I think it was, and the age roughly corresponded with his birth date, but they were never able to find out whether that was John's youngest son. And he never, as I say, never contacted the family after he left. There may have been some dispute about the will, or it may be that he wasn't happy with his father's new wife. We just don't know. It's speculated in by the book that's written by one of his great-great-great-grandsons. But Eleanor, along with Richard and Frederick, continued farming at Morby after John's death. Young Anne married Abraham William Morgan of Toodyay in 1844 and started her own life. In 1902, a Mr. Morgan and some of John Morell's grandchildren erected a brick monument to provide a permanent protection to the grave. This was refurbished by the Northern Roads Board and a plaque attached as part of the state centenary in 1929. The grave was re-erected by Morell's descendants in 1965. We think that's due to the realignment of the road, and although the memorial was relocated, we're not 100% sure that John was. They did ask the Shire to exhume and reinter him, but there's no recorded outcome of those discussions. So he may in fact still lie under Gamelling Road. Anyway, ground penetrating radar. We'll have to get out there one day and have a look. So Morby Cottage, Morby Farm and the Island Farm were subdivided and sold off over the years until Morby Cottage on Catrine Road remained. In the 1980s, Morby Cottage was acquired by a Morell descendant and gifted to the then town of Northam and Shire of Northam, with a joint management agreement between the councils, and a management committee of volunteers set about preserving and restoring the cottage and setting up displays of early colonial life in Western Australia and of Northam and the Morell family in particular, with much assistance from the Morell descendants. And as I say, you'll hopefully get a chance to go out and see that this afternoon. So the second part, I'm not sure how we're doing for time. Yeah, well, good. No 5-minute warning. My theatrical background is that when you go over time, a hook comes out from the wings and grabs you around the neck and hauls you off. So I hope they don't have to do that with me. I can talk quite successfully underwater, apparently. So the further development of Northam. So Northam's first church, the old St James Church, was built on a 48-acre ecclesiastical grant adjoining Morby Farm. The foundation stone was laid on the 30th of January 1851 and was built partly with convict labour from the Toodyay convict depot and was completed in 1852. The church was extended in 1865 to cater for the increasing Northam and district population and was consecrated by the Right Reverend Dr Hale, Bishop of Perth, on the 28th of May of 1865. In use until 1890, when the more substantial St John's Federation Anglican Church in Wellington Street was completed and opened. The old St James was demolished in 1904, though a memorial cross was erected on the site of the altar and can still be seen today. In 1858, a former convict, Thomas Wilding, who owned substantial farming property in Mocone and Spencers Brook to the west of Northam, built the Avon Inn adjoining the Avon River where the Avon Bridge is today. In 1860, he built a 2-storey stone building next to the inn, which was used as a retail store. The original inn was demolished in June of 1906, and the stone store was incorporated into what then became known as the Avon Bridge Hotel and still trades today as the Riverside Hotel. The original 1860-built stone store can still be seen on the Fitzgerald Street frontage. So Morby Cottage, having served as a school for children of Northam settlers, but in the early 60s, a 2-room mud brick school was built in Old York Road, which was later known as Banksia Cottage. The Northam Historical Society believes that this building still exists today, albeit in a much extended form and in use as a private residence. And in 1861, there was a very great event that happened to Northam, though none of the settlers probably realised it at the time, and that was 21-year-old George Throssell arrived in Northam and set himself up as a produce merchant. He had arrived in the colony from Ireland as a 10-year-old in 1850, but his parents had both died by the time he was 15. He served an apprenticeship to a grocer in Fremantle before moving to Northam to set up on his own. So a very successful businessman, he would go on to own several farms, many residential properties, and a string of shops, including the Big Store, which still stands in Peel Terrace near the current railway station today. If John Morell was the father of Northam, George Throssell would soon become known as the Lion of Northam. George married Annie Morell, who was the daughter of Richard, in 1861, soon after he arrived in Northam. They had 12 children, including Hugo, known as Jim, who was the first West Australian to win a Victoria Cross in World War I during the Gallipoli campaign. And if any of you go on the town walk, they'll probably almost certainly include his statue, which was erected 2016, I think, for the centenary of his award. George was elected to the Municipal Council in 1880 and was later chairman and mayor in 1833 and from 1885 to 1887. He served as MLA for Northam. He was elected, as MLA for Northam in 1890 and served until 1904. He was very briefly Premier of the state after John Forrest moved into federal politics, but George's ministry only lasted from the 15th of February 1901 to the 27th of May 1901. He retired as an MLA in June of 1904 following the death of his wife due to illness and increasing deafness. He was, however, persuaded to run for MLC for the East Province and served from the 12th of August 1907 until his death on the 30th of August 1910 at the age of 70. His house, Fermoy House, is currently the St Joseph's Church private primary school. and he fell down a set of steps going to the basement there and never really recovered. He lingered for 2 or 3 days and then died. So by 1865, a brick and shingle police station on Northam has opened to the north of the existing town at the junction of Catrine Road and Irish Town. We believe that this building also still exists in a much derelict condition in a paddock a few hundred metres away from the road. In 1866, Ainsworth store was opened in Fitzgerald Street. So the town then started to move south. This public house became known as the Farmer's Home, which was totally redeveloped at the turn of the 1900s, the start of the 1900s, to become the Shamrock Hotel, and was known as that for over a century. But in the 2000s, the Shamrock was reinvented as a dome inn and has reverted to the Farmer's Home, named by the current owners. It proudly displays the 1866 date on the facade. However, that is just Joseph O'Hara's marketing. He took the original date when the Farmer's Home was built, completely demolished the Farmer's Home and rebuilt the Shamrock Hotel. Now, in February 1867, Thomas Wilding completed a steam-powered flour mill with some stone grinding wheels next to his inn and store, which was later purchased by James Byfield and substantially rebuilt as a steel roller mill, the second one of its kind in WA, which opened in March 1890. And the flour mill is still there and in production to this day. Morby Cottage was also used as a mail collection point from the 1830s, but in the 1850s, the postal agency was moved to some emerging businesses in the town, and the first post office was constructed in 1873 on the corner of Wellington Street and Hawes Street. But storm damage in the early 1890s resulted in its almost complete rebuilding. This building remains today and is largely in its 1890s appearance and serves as the Northam family medical practice. In December of 1878, a two-class room school for the first official government school in Northam was opened in Wellington Street, next to the Northam Post Office, and this building also survives to this day. Now, the coming of the railways, the Northam railway line to Northam opened on the 13th of October 1886, and it was the end of a 15-kilometre branch line from Spencers Brook on the Eastern Railway, and terminated at a small wooden station building at the very western edge of town in what the locals called a dismal swamp. This rail connection greatly assisted Northam farmers in transporting produce to markets in Perth and in Fremantle. The discovery of gold in the Yilgarn in the early 1890s led to the government extending the Eastern Railway to cater for the influx of miners from the eastern states and from overseas. After considering Toodyay, Northam and York as potential starting points for the Eastern Goldfields Railway, Northam was selected, much to the chagrin of the older established towns of Toodyay and particularly of York. There's an apocryphal story because they can never understand why Northam was chosen as the starting off point, whereas York and Toodyay were both more established and larger populations. Toodyay, unfortunately, there's still some more hills to get through before you get onto the plain, but the cost per mile of rail between York and Northam was minuscule. The story goes, as largely told by York people, that the MLAs for Northam, George Throssell, Toodyay, who I think was a Mr. Harper, and York, believe it or not, there was 3 MLAs, one in York, one in Northam and one in York at the time, sat down and played a game of cards, and George Throssell won out. So technically that's why the line started off from Northam. Whatever the reasons were, that future of Northam was then assured, and the population just absolutely boomed. A much larger brick Northern Railway station was built almost next to the old one, and a goods shed, an extension marshalling yard was built at West Northam, and a railway station and goods yard at East Northam. Just across the railway tracks from here actually was the old East Northam station, now long gone. By 1907, over 1,000 people were employed by the railways in Northam and Spencers Brook, from engine drivers and firemen, guards and porters, fitters and turners to maintain the engines and rolling stock, and a large population of fettlers and gangers living at Spencers Brook, which drove a building boom in banks, hotels, grocers, clothing suppliers, and also in government agencies such as schools and the Northam Government Hospital. So George Christmas, who was a long-time employee of the Northern Municipal Council, starting off as a rates clerk and rising to be the town clerk of the municipality of Northam, observed in 1953, the status of Northam has changed from a village to a town, and its real progress commenced when the government decided to construct the railway to the Eastern Goldfields through Northam instead of York or Toodyay, either of which might have been chosen, leaving this town in somewhat of a backwater. I feel sure that the government's decision was largely influenced by the late Honourable George Throssell. Once the railway was in process of construction, a railway station was provided at East Northam, and that section of the town, which was already the main business centre, expanded fairly rapidly, and large chaff and grain stores were erected fronting onto the railway yards to facilitate yarding, and engineering works were opened in York Road, and the Transcontinental Hotel was erected, which is where McDonald's is today. At the same time, West Northam was developing almost as a separate town because of the railway workers wanting to be near their place of employment, and in any case there were no houses available in town. A canvas town took shape on land now occupied by the West Northam State School, which is also now no longer there, but anyway, down in the area of West Northam, and the Shell Company Depot, also no longer there, and the proportion of the West Northam Reserve. And it was not until about 1920 that business people began to fill the empty spaces in Fitzgerald Street, west of Avon Street, and overcome the extent of isolation of the east and west, and became a town as such. That's it. No hook. I believe it's question time. Got some questions? I press you skip that. Who's got a question? Oh.
We do have a question. Jeffrey, thanks again. Wow. First of all, poor John. It was rough back then, wasn't it? Just such a different time. And I mean, we have our complaints today, but hearing that story, I don't know about you guys, but I just think, wow, we really have it easy, and we really are quite lucky thanks to a couple of forefathers there. And also Morby Cottage, wow, that had a big job to play with all of those functions coming out of that. And also, apparently, what can't a game of cards solve? We do have a question from the floor, and the question is, what do we know about the relationship between the early settlers you have been talking about and local Aboriginal people?
Okay. In the Northern Historical Society, we try not to cover Aboriginal history because we believe that is for the Aboriginal people to discuss. However, Peter Chidlow and his partner Edward Jones were speared to death by Aboriginals on the Catrine Road out to Toodyay, and there is talk of reprisals that were made, but we don't know of what reprisals they were. Perhaps some of the Aboriginal people may be able to expand on that, but outside of the fact that the two white settlers were killed, we don't tend to explore the Aboriginal side of it and put our white interpretation onto their history. So if they want to, I believe there's an Aboriginal person's talking later, perhaps that's possibly more a question for them. It appears that, the Aboriginal people were they were integrated into the police. There was quite a lot of black trackers mentioned in the 1860s and 1870s when people were lost, which happened quite a lot. There were Aboriginal people that worked on the farms. Whether they were getting paid a decent wage or whether they were just doing it for a bag of flour, we don't really know. But that's outside of that, they probably resented the fact that although the Morels were the first, then many others came afterwards, the Brockmans, the Leaders, the Morgans out at Irishtown and whatever, and they must have felt probably threatened by the white invasion. But as far as we know, there was no real, apart from the spearing of Chidlow and Jones, there was no real frontier wars that they like to talk about these days.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And we do have some Balladong speakers coming up shortly. And also, the BKB, the Billia Court Budja, is an amazing cultural centre that does speak to the answer to that question a little bit as well, and the story from those first Australians, the traditional landowners here. We've got another question from the floor here. Okay, so was there a railway line between Northam and York, and did it link to the Great Southern Railway?
Okay, not directly. The Eastern Railway came up out of, let's say Midland, probably Kalamunda at the time, but came up through Chidlow's Well, Clack Line, and arrived at Spencers Brook, which is about 15 kilometres back towards Perth. So the line then went from Spencers Brook to York, because York was the older established, much larger town. I think that was in the late 1870s from memory that the line arrived at York. There was then a private land grant railway that was built between Beverley and Albany in the 1890s, the Great Southern Rail Company. They operated a railway line. It was a land grant company. Not very common in Australia. They were more common in America, but they would get a certain amount of acres of land to sell for farming land alongside the line that they built in exchange for building the line. Now, the Great Southern Land Railway only lasted about 10 years, and then it was absorbed into the then West Australian Government Railways. The other one that persisted for a lot longer, which some of you will probably remember, was the Midland Railway. It used to run from Midland up through Walkaway and to Geraldton. And the West Australian Government Railways built a line in direct competition with that later to try and force it out of business, but they did manage to survive until the 1960s when they were finally absorbed into the then Westrail Government Railway system. So the line that came from Spencers Brook to Northam and literally just stopped at the western edge of town, that was just in response to the farmers saying, we need to get our goods to market, we need to get our grain to market, we can't go down with drays to Perth. So that was the line. So you could travel Northam to Spencers Brook to York, but then that was the reason. The line from to Toodyay went off at Bachina, I think it was. The line went to Newcastle. So that's when they had the problem of the three railheads. They had Toodyay to the north, Northam in the middle, and York to the south, and they had to decide where the Eastern Goldfields Railway was going to start from, and as I say, that's when Northam won out.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Your head, I'd love to. That's amazing. So, have we got any other questions from the floor? Okay, so. Yep. How did the relative decline of rail and the rise of the motor car affect the relative importance of Northam?
Northam was still a vital and important rail centre probably up until the 1990s when they started to move freight onto roads and trucks rather than rail. We still had engine drivers, firemen, guards, whatever, living in Northam up until then. But after then, and then with the decentralisation of rail in the early 2000s and the rise of companies like ARC and Horizon and now CBH, who's got their own railway wagons and whatever, all those people now live in Perth. So the importance of the railways, we went from having probably 1,000 people employed in 1907, which was probably the peak, down to maybe 30 or 40 by the mid-2000s. And now you'd be lucky to find many railway employees that actually live in Northam. I mean, the railway station is leased out as office space. There's only one person there 4 half days a week to sell railway tickets. And the move to buy tickets and stuff online has meant that they really don't even need them anymore. Though apparently they're still given the grand title of station master, which used to mean a lot more in 1907. Yeah.
Definitely times have changed, haven't they? Oh, we've got another question here. Okay. Was the Avon River used for any transportation of goods?
No, not as far as I'm aware. The Avon River, in common with most rivers in the northern part of Australia, Western Australia, is essentially a drain. They only run when it's raining, and then when the rain stops, they stop running. So we only have the pool in Northam because in 1910, associated with that boom from the railways in the late 1890s and more people coming to town, the council decided that they wanted to dam the river and keep a permanent pool of water in the river where people could go boating and swimming and all that sort of stuff. And so the weir was built in the 1910 or 1911, somewhere around about then. But as every person that lives in Northam knows, south of the, west, although the river does a U-turn, west of the river and at Toodyay, for instance, there's like no water in the river. So it's not like the Murray or the Darling that runs all year round where you can put steamboats and whatever on it. In fact, people didn't even go down it by pleasure craft until the Avon descent. In the early 70s, a couple of people wanting to prove an alternative fuel source took a motorboat down the river from Northam to Perth in the winter, obviously, when the river was flowing, which then birthed later the Avon descent, which has been going now for 50-odd years. So, no, not for transport. The only transport early days was drays and then rail, and then much later, after probably really 1930s when trucks started to become used for more, but they're only like little 2-tonner, 3-tonner trucks. But the bulk of the produce still went up until after the Second World War by rail. It was only in the post-Second World War boom that trucks became larger and that became a viable option for freight.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Are there any questions from the floor for those who are not able to access the Q&A online? We have one question in the back.
I'm sorry, I have to say something about the fact that we don't know about the violence against Balladong people in the northern area. It's quite well documented that Lieutenant Bunbury conducted 2 massacres in this area, ranging from Toodyay through Northam down to York and down to Beverley in 1836 and 1837. If you read Jim Cameron's diary of Lieutenant Bunbury's activities, you can find evidence of that, including the names of 11 Balladong warriors who were killed in 1837 during these activities. And I do think this area needs much more research and to be acknowledged. And also the fact that one of the Chidlow brothers killed Yilgarn's brother in Perth. So the Chidlows were involved in violence against Noongar people, and we should acknowledge that. Thank you.
I suppose my point, and we were advised of this by WA Museums many years ago, not to display Aboriginal artefacts because you are not the person to appropriately interpret that. You are not to explain Aboriginal history because you are not the person that's appropriate to explain that. I'm glad that the Balladong people are taking ownership of researching their own history, and yes, they can hopefully share it with us to give us a more complete picture. But the point I was trying to make, maybe a bit odd-handedly, was that we don't think it's appropriate for us to interpret someone else's history any more than we would talk to the Chinese people about their history and pretend we knew all about that. So yes, it is great that the Balladong people are taking ownership of that, and congratulations. Still more time to fill.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Yes. Up the front, thank you. There's a mic coming, just hold that thought.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for the lots of information. But I think you actually missed just one important thing that we should remember is the narrow gauge railway actually went through the middle of Northam. And if you go down to the shopping centres, that was built on the railway track and it's had lots of fill, but you can still find some of the tracks around there. But basically, 1960, was it?
1966, yes.
Yeah, 1966, when they closed that down, that was what was making Northam so important, as having so many staff and that was, yes, there was, I think it was at least 2 tracks going through. So if you want to go down to the shopping centre, there's that. There's so much history with the railways that I'm fascinated with. So, but that was the thing, is it wasn't just 1990s. It was when we went from standard gauge, narrow gauge to standard gauge. And if anybody gets the chance to go over towards Toodyay, you can actually see both gauges are still there. So the railways were important to WA.
Yeah, I thought that I'd probably have more information to fill a half-hour talk if I talked about Northam from 1831 to 2026. So I decided that the railway cut-off, which I finished on, and I think I probably explained the importance of that, you know, to the 1,000 people working here, as opposed to could have been no one, and the difference between Northam becoming the go-ahead town while Toodyay and York essentially stymied their development at that stage. But you're right, with the completion of the Trans-Australia Railway, which was between Kalgoorlie and Port Augusta in 1917 at the end of the First World War, that then meant that all interstate rail travel was through Northam as well. So yes, and yeah, towns these days like to make sure that the railway stations are on the edge of town, but ours was almost right in the middle of it, and the railway line ran literally straight through, as you say, between Fitzgerald Street and Wellington Street, in one door of the Boulevard Shopping Centre and out the other, and up to Peel Terrace here, where it turned off and joined the formation, now the old formation, but the new formation onto Kalgoorlie. The East Northern Railway Station, which was literally opposite McDonald's, was then demolished, and the 1966 standard gauge rail project went through. We had dual gauge line up to Northam, and then there was a single gauge line that went through the Wheatbelt areas to Merredin, but the narrow gauge line between Northam and Merredin and Kalgoorlie was completely replaced by the standard gauge 4 foot 8.5. Yeah. And does anyone know how we end up with 3 gauges of rail in Australia? Maybe. Well, I'll tell you my story. There was an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman. So the railway engineers of New South Wales and Victoria were both Englishmen. And they said, look, we're going to build this railway. We're never going to connect Melbourne and Sydney. Ha, 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 what a joke. But if we decide on a gauge of rail, we can buy our locomotives and our rolling stock all from the one supplier and get a significant discount. Oh, what a good idea, said the other one. 4 foot 8.5 it is. He then got replaced as the engineer for Victoria, and he said, an Irishman, we're going for the gauge, the step of Brian Boru, 5 foot 3. So it still doesn't matter, because Melbourne and Sydney are never going to be connected by rail, but we're going our own way, thanks very much. Now, the engineers of Queensland and Western Australia were Scottish trained. So they went for the narrow gauge 3 foot 6 gauge, which was an ideal gauge actually when you're building long tracks over sometimes mountainous country and very few population centres in between, because it's cheaper to build, cheaper to maintain, quicker to lay. So that's why the larger states of Western Australia and Queensland went for 3 foot 6. But that is essentially the Scottish, or the original Scottish gauge. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one more question at the front here. Thanks.
This is actually just more of a general question. Just listening to Jeffrey and how much information was in his, what he was talking about this morning is an enormous amount to absorb, but it was incredibly interesting. And I was just wondering, probably with Jeffrey and all the other people that are going to present over the next couple of days, are we able to access what he has said so that we can take it away and reread it? It's just so much great information, but I thought, I can't remember, I've been writing down bits and pieces, and I thought, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah.
The organisers have just given me the nod. Each of the attendees will be emailed
Thank you.
the presentation notes. Yes. Thank you. Great question. And it's if you're furiously writing notes, you can relax now.
Be a little bit in dates. Like I was trying to do it on a date and a logical progression, but when you're out at Morby Cottage, you'll be much more relaxed and tell you a lot of more stories. So if we've got a few minutes, I will just share one with you. And this goes to what Teresa was saying about the hard life that faced people in the 1830s. Morby, as I mentioned, was a mail collection point. Call it a post office if you like. But the postman used to call in there to collect mail from the Northam settlers, who would bring it into Morby Cottage, and then he would leave the mail there at Morby Cottage to be distributed amongst the other local settlers, few and far between as they may have been. So he did that the first postman did that on foot. So he set out from Guildford on a Monday morning and he walked to Toodyay, which took him about a day and a half. So when he got to Toodyay, he dropped off the mail at Toodyay, picked up the mail, stayed overnight at Toodyay. The next day, he walked over to Northam. So this is on the Wednesday. He walked Newcastle or Toodyay to Northam, just dropped off the mail, stayed overnight at Morby Cottage. On Thursday, he walked from Northam to York, stayed overnight at York, and then walked back to Guildford on the following day. So that was a whole week of walking. He had a day off, and then he started again on the following Monday and did the whole circuit again. He wasn't provided with a horse for quite a number of years, but he was occasionally provided with a Aboriginal servant to carry the mail if he had lots of mail to carry, to help carry the mail, I should say, and their supplies. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. I mean, we know why they didn't have gyms back then. They just had life. Folks, put your hands together again for Jeffrey Pollard. Thank you so much.